Hey everyone, hope you're doing well, and I'm so glad you've decided to join us again. Tonight we are exploring a day of food in the life of a medieval apprentice. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy our nighttime stories. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now it's time to dim the lights and relax as we start our story. The morning bell of St. Bartholomew would ring across the narrow streets of London, just as the first pale light began to seep through the oiled parchment windows of Master Geoffrey's workshop, and young Thomas would feel the rough hemp of his straw mattress beneath his shoulders as he stirred from sleep, knowing that his day would begin with the same careful ritual of breaking his fast that had sustained apprentices in the Furriers' Guild for generations before him. The wooden bowl that sat beside his sleeping pallet was carved from a single piece of oak, its interior smooth from years of use by apprentices who had learned their trade in this same workshop, and Thomas would run his fingers along its familiar rim as he prepared to receive his morning portion of pottage, that thick gruel of oats and barley that formed the foundation of every apprentice's sustenance throughout the long days of learning his craft. Master Geoffrey's wife, Goodwife Margaret, would have risen before dawn to tend the cooking fire in the workshop's small kitchen, stirring the great iron cauldron that hung from its blackened chain above the glowing coals, and the pottage would bubble and thicken as she added measured handfuls of oats that had been purchased from the grain merchants who gathered each week in Cheapside Market. The oats themselves came from fields beyond the city walls, where tenant farmers had harvested them under the autumn sun and threshed them with wooden flails on stone floors, separating the grain from its husks through the repetitive motion of beating and winnowing that had changed little since the time of the Saxons. These oats would be stored in great sacks of undyed wool, their surfaces rough to the touch, and tied at the neck with lengths of twisted hemp rope that left faint marks on the fingers of those who handled them. The barley that joined the oats in the morning pottage came from the same rural sources, but its preparation required different considerations, for barley needed to be pearled and sorted with greater care, removing the outer hull that could make the grain difficult to digest for those who performed the long hours of physical labor that apprenticeship demanded. Goodwife Margaret would examine each handful of barley before adding it to the pot, looking for the telltale signs of weevil damage or moisture rot that could spoil an entire batch of pottage, and she would discard any grains that showed the small holes or dark spots that indicated contamination. The process of examining and sorting the grain created a gentle rhythm in the early morning kitchen, the soft sound of barley falling into the wooden sorting bowl mixing with the quiet crackle of the cooking fire. Water for the pottage came from the communal well that served the street where Master Geoffrey's workshop stood, and this water carried with it the particular mineral taste of London's ancient springs, a flavour that Thomas had grown accustomed to over his 2 years of apprenticeship, but which still seemed foreign to his tongue when he remembered the sweeter water of his father's farm in Kent. The well itself was constructed of fitted stones that had been quarried from the chalk downs south of the city, and its rope and bucket were maintained by contributions from all the households that drew their daily water from its depths. On mornings when the rope showed signs of fraying, the cooper who lived 3 doors down from Master Geoffrey would splice new lengths of hemp into the old line, working the fibers together with his thick fingers, until the join was smooth and strong enough to bear the weight of the iron-bound bucket. Salt would be added to the pottage in small pinches, measured out from the leather pouch that hung beside the kitchen fire, and this salt had travelled a great distance to reach Master Geoffrey's table, carried by merchants who had purchased it from the salt works along the coast of Norfolk, where seawater was channeled into shallow pans and left to evaporate under the sun and wind, until only the white crystals remained. The salt itself carried a faint taste of the sea, with tiny granules that dissolved slowly on the tongue and left behind a clean, sharp flavour that brought out the earthier notes of the oats and barley. The amount of salt used in each batch of pottage was carefully regulated by guild customs that specified the proper proportions for maintaining the health of apprentices, for too little salt could lead to weakness during the long days of work, while too much was considered wasteful of a commodity that represented a significant expense for any workshop that housed and fed young craftsmen. When the pottage had reached the proper consistency, thick enough to coat a wooden spoon but still liquid enough to be easily consumed, Goodwife Margaret would ladle it into Thomas's wooden bowl, filling it nearly to the rim, so that he would have sufficient nourishment to carry him through the morning hours of his apprenticeship. The ladle she used was carved from a single piece of beech wood, its handle worn smooth by daily use, and its bowl shaped to fit perfectly into the curve of the iron cauldron. The wood had been treated with linseed oil when it was first made, giving it a subtle golden color that had deepened over the years of use, and the oil helped to prevent the wood from cracking under the repeated exposure to hot liquids. Thomas would eat his pottage slowly, savoring each spoonful while seated on the wooden stool that had been placed beside the kitchen fire for the comfort of apprentices taking their meals. The spoon he used was made of horn, carved from the antler of a red deer that had been hunted in the royal forests outside London, and its surface was polished to a pale cream color that felt smooth against his lips. The horn spoon was lighter than wood, and less likely to retain the flavors of previous meals, making it particularly suitable for the delicate task of eating the morning pottage, without any interference from lingering tastes of the previous day's supper. As Thomas ate, he could hear the sounds of the workshop beginning to stir with the day's activity, the soft footsteps of the other apprentices moving about their morning tasks, the gentle scraping of wooden tools being arranged on workbenches, and the quiet conversation between Master Geoffrey and his journeyman, as they discussed the furs that would need attention during the coming day. These sounds created a familiar backdrop to the morning meal, reminding Thomas of his place within the larger community of craftsmen who shared the rhythms of guild life, bound together by the common experiences of learning their trade, and maintaining the standards that had been established by generations of furriers before them. The wooden bowl would be nearly empty when Thomas scraped the last of the pottage from its bottom, using his horn spoon to gather every remaining trace of the thick gruel, for waste was not tolerated in Master Geoffrey's household, and apprentices were expected to consume every portion of food that was provided for their sustenance. The bowl would then be wiped clean with a piece of rough linen cloth that was kept beside the kitchen fire for this purpose, and Thomas would inspect its surface to ensure that no residue remained that might sour or attract insects during the hours before the next meal. The linen cloth itself was woven from flax that had been grown in the fields of Lincolnshire, where the plant had been harvested when its stalks reached their proper height, and then processed through the lengthy procedures of retting, breaking, and hackling that were necessary to separate the useful fibers from the woody stems. After the morning pottage, Thomas's next substantial meal would not come until the dinner hour, when the church bells of the city marked the middle of the day, and work in the furrier's workshop would pause for the taking of food that would provide energy for the afternoon's labor. This midday meal would be more substantial than the morning pottage, often featuring a thick soup made from whatever vegetables were available in the local markets, along with small portions of meat when the household budget allowed for such provisions. The vegetables that appeared in these soups changed with the seasons, following the ancient patterns of cultivation that determined what would be available in the market stalls during each month of the year. During the spring months, when Thomas had first arrived at Master Geoffrey's workshop as a new apprentice, the soups would contain leeks and onions that had overwintered in the market gardens outside the city walls, their green shoots fresh and tender from the mild weather that followed the harsh months of winter. These leeks would be cleaned with careful attention to removing the grit that often clung to their lower stems, and they would be chopped with sharp iron knives into pieces of uniform size that would cook evenly in the great pot that simmered over the kitchen fire. The onions required different treatment, their papery outer skins removed and discarded, their white flesh sliced into thin crescents that would become translucent and sweet as they slowly cooked in the soup. As spring gave way to summer, fresh peas would appear in the kitchen, their bright green pods split open to reveal the small sweet peas that would be added to the soup during the final stages of cooking to preserve their delicate flavor and texture. The pea pods themselves would not be wasted, but would be added to the pot early in the cooking process, to provide additional flavor and substance to the broth, then removed before the soup was served. The process of shelling peas became a communal activity in Master Geoffrey's household, with apprentices and servants working together in the kitchen courtyard, their fingers moving with practiced efficiency as they split open pod after pod, the small peas falling into wooden bowls with gentle pattering sounds. Summer also brought cabbages to the apprentices' table, their large pale green leaves tough enough to withstand long cooking and substantial enough to provide real nourishment for young men engaged in physical labor. The cabbages would be examined carefully for signs of insect damage, their outer leaves stripped away and discarded if they showed the telltale holes that indicated the presence of cabbage worms. The remaining leaves would be cut into ribbons with sharp knives, their thick stems removed and set aside for longer cooking, while the more tender portions would be added to the soup later in the process, to prevent them from becoming too soft and losing their structure. When autumn arrived, and Thomas had been with Master Geoffrey for more than a year, the character of the midday soups would shift to incorporate the root vegetables that had been harvested from the surrounding countryside, and brought to London's markets by cart and pack horse. Carrots would appear, their orange flesh sweet and firm, requiring careful scraping to remove their outer skin, and revealing the bright color beneath. These carrots would be cut into small pieces that would hold their shape during the long slow cooking that was necessary to blend all the flavors of the soup into a harmonious whole. Turnips would join the carrots in the autumn soups, their white flesh more subtle in flavor, but equally nutritious for apprentices who needed substantial food to sustain their growing bodies through the long days of learning their craft. The turnips required more careful preparation than the carrots, for their skin was tougher, and needed to be removed with greater attention to avoid waste, and their flesh had a tendency to become mealy if overcooked, requiring precise timing in their addition to the soup pot. The process of preparing turnips became almost meditative in its repetition, the steady scraping of the knife against the vegetable's surface creating a rhythm that matched the other sounds of the busy kitchen. Parsnips would add their distinctive sweet flavor to the winter soups, their pale flesh more delicate than turnips but requiring similar care in preparation. The parsnips that appeared in London's markets during the coldest months had often been left in the ground until after the first frost, which was said to improve their flavor by converting some of their starches to sugars. Master Geoffrey's cook would examine each parsnip carefully, looking for signs of softness or discoloration that might indicate spoilage, and would trim away any portions that did not meet her exacting standards for the food that would nourish the apprentices under her care. The herbs that flavored these seasonal soups came from different sources depending on the time of year, and the availability of various plants that grew wild in the countryside, or were cultivated in the small gardens that many London households maintained behind their workshops and dwellings. Thyme would be gathered from the hillsides outside the city during the summer months, when its small purple flowers were in bloom, and its leaves carried the strongest concentration of the oils that gave the herb its distinctive flavor. The thyme would be dried in bundles hung from the rafters of the kitchen, where the warm air that rose from the cooking fire would slowly remove the moisture from the leaves while preserving their essential character. Sage would be used more sparingly, for its strong flavor could easily overwhelm the delicate balance of the soup, but when added in small quantities it provided a depth of taste that complemented the earthier flavors of the root vegetables that formed the soup's foundation. The sage that reached Master Geoffrey's kitchen came from plants that had been carefully tended in monastery gardens, where the monks who grew herbs for both culinary and medicinal purposes had developed methods for cultivating sage that produced leaves of exceptional quality and potency. Rosemary would appear in the soups during certain seasons, its needle-like leaves adding a pine-like fragrance that seemed to warm the kitchen even on the coldest days of winter. The rosemary plant was more tender than thyme or sage, requiring protection from the harshest weather, and so it was often grown in large pots that could be moved to sheltered locations when frost threatened. The branches of rosemary would be added to the soup whole and then removed before serving, for the leaves were too tough and resinous to be consumed directly, but their essential oils would infuse the broth with their characteristic aroma and flavor. The meat that occasionally appeared in the apprentices' midday soup came from various sources, depending on the season and the current state of Master Geoffrey's accounts with the local butchers and meat vendors who supplied the households of the furriers' quarter. During prosperous periods, when the workshop had completed several profitable commissions for wealthy merchants or minor nobility, the soup might contain small pieces of beef that had been cut from the less tender portions of the carcass, the shoulder, or neck meat that required long, slow cooking to become palatable but which provided substantial nourishment for those engaged in physical labor. The beef would come from cattle that had been raised in the pastures surrounding London, where they had grazed on grass that grew in fields that had been fertilized with the accumulated waste from the city's stables and workshops. These cattle would be driven to market on foot, their hooves creating clouds of dust on the roads that led into the city, and they would be slaughtered in the licensed abattoirs that operated under the supervision of the Butchers' Guild, which maintained strict standards for the handling and preparation of meat that would be sold to the city's residents. When beef was not available, or was too expensive for the household budget, the soup might contain mutton from sheep that had been raised on the rolling hills of the counties surrounding London, where flocks grazed on the short grass that grew on the chalky soil of the downs. Mutton had a stronger flavor than beef and required different preparation, with careful trimming of the fat that could make the soup too rich for the delicate stomachs of young apprentices, who were not accustomed to heavy foods. The mutton would be cut into small pieces and browned in the iron pot before the vegetables were added, a process that helped to seal in the meat's juices and prevent it from becoming tough during the long cooking process. Occasionally, when neither beef nor mutton was available, the soup would contain poultry that had been purchased from the farmers who brought their birds to market in wooden cages that were carried on the backs of sturdy horses or loaded onto ox-drawn carts. These birds were usually older chickens or roosters that had outlived their usefulness as egg layers or breeding stock, and their meat was tougher than that of younger birds, requiring extended cooking to become tender enough for consumption. The poultry would be plucked and cleaned by the kitchen servants, their feathers saved for use as stuffing in the pallets and cushions that provided comfort in the workshop's living quarters. The bones from whatever meat was used in the soup would never be discarded, but would be saved and added to a separate pot where they would be simmered with water and aromatic vegetables to create the bone broth that would serve as the foundation for future soups. This process of making bone broth was a continuous one in Master Geoffrey's kitchen, with bones being added to the pot as they became available, and the resulting liquid being strained and stored in large earthenware crocks that were kept in the coolest part of the kitchen to prevent spoilage. The bread that accompanied the midday soup was baked according to regulations established by the Bakers' Guild, which specified the precise weights and ingredients that could be used in loaves sold to the public. The bread that reached Master Geoffrey's table was made from a mixture of wheat and rye flour, the proportions varying according to the relative prices of these grains in the London markets. When wheat was plentiful and reasonably priced, the bread would contain a higher proportion of wheat flour, resulting in loaves that were lighter in color and finer in texture, with a mild flavor that complemented the more robust tastes of the soup without competing for attention. During periods when wheat was scarce or expensive, the proportion of rye flour in the bread would increase, producing loaves that were darker and denser, with a slightly sour flavor that came from the natural fermentation processes that occurred during the bread's preparation. Rye flour required different handling than wheat flour, being less elastic and more prone to producing heavy compact loaves if not properly managed by skilled bakers, who understood the particular requirements of this grain. The yeast that leavened the bread came from various sources, sometimes purchased from brewers who had excess yeast from their beer-making operations, and sometimes cultivated by the bakers themselves through the maintenance of sourdough starters that were passed down from master to apprentice within the baking guilds. These starters were living cultures that required daily attention, being fed with fresh flour and water according to carefully established schedules that ensured their continued vitality and effectiveness in leavening bread. Thomas would tear his portion of bread into small pieces before dipping them into his soup, allowing the bread to absorb the flavorful broth while maintaining enough structure to be easily lifted to his mouth with his horn spoon. The bread served not only as nourishment, but also as a tool for consuming the soup, helping to stretch the liquid portion of the meal, and providing the additional substance that growing apprentices needed to maintain their strength throughout the long afternoon of work that lay ahead. The evening meal in Master Geoffrey's household followed different patterns than the morning pottage or midday soup, often consisting of foods that required less cooking time, and could be prepared quickly after the day's work in the workshop had concluded. This meal might feature peas porridge, made from dried peas that had been soaked overnight, and then boiled until they broke down into a thick, nutritious paste that could be seasoned with small amounts of bacon fat or herb butter, when such ingredients were available. The dried peas used for the evening porridge came from the same summer crops that had provided fresh peas for the midday soups, but these had been left on their plants until they were fully mature, and their moisture content had decreased to the point where they could be stored for extended periods without spoilage. The process of drying peas required careful attention to weather conditions, for they needed to be harvested when the pods were completely dry,
but before autumn rains could cause them to rot or sprout prematurely.
Once harvested, the dried peas would be stored in large sacks made from tightly woven linen, their surfaces treated with oils and waxes to repel moisture and insects that might otherwise damage the stored legumes. These sacks would be kept in the dry, cool storage areas beneath Master Geoffrey's workshop, where they would remain viable for consumption throughout the winter months, when fresh vegetables were not available in the London markets. The preparation of peas porridge required soaking the dried peas in clean water for at least 12 hours before cooking, allowing them to absorb moisture and begin the process of softening that would continue during the cooking process. The water used for soaking would be changed several times during this period, removing any impurities that might have been released from the peas and ensuring that the final porridge would have a clean, pleasant flavor. When the soaking period was complete, the peas would be drained and placed in a clean pot with fresh water, then brought slowly to a boil over the kitchen fire. The cooking process required patience and regular attention, for the peas needed to be stirred frequently to prevent them from sticking to the bottom of the pot and burning, which would ruin the entire batch and waste valuable food that could not easily be replaced. As the peas cooked, they would gradually break down and release their starch into the cooking liquid, creating a thick porridge-like consistency that provided substantial nourishment for apprentices who had spent the day engaged in the physical labor of learning their craft. The cooking process would continue until the individual peas were no longer recognizable, having been transformed into a smooth, homogeneous mass that could be easily digested and that would remain satisfying throughout the long night hours until the next morning's pottage. Bacon fat would sometimes be added to the peas porridge, providing additional calories and a rich, smoky flavor that made the simple dish more appealing to young men who had worked hard throughout the day and needed substantial food to restore their energy. The bacon fat came from pigs that had been raised on the farms surrounding London, where they had been fed on acorns and kitchen scraps that were collected from the city's households and transported to the countryside by cart. The process of rendering bacon fat required careful attention to temperature and timing, for fat that was heated too quickly would burn and become bitter, while fat that was not heated sufficiently would not render properly and would remain solid and unpalatable. The rendered fat would be stored in small earthenware pots that were kept in the coolest part of the kitchen, where it would remain fresh and usable for several weeks if properly protected from exposure to air and light. Herb butter would occasionally replace bacon fat as a flavoring for the peas porridge, particularly during periods when meat was expensive or when religious observances required the household to abstain from animal products. The herb butter was made by mixing finely chopped herbs into fresh butter that had been churned from cream purchased from the dairy farmers who brought their products to London's markets each morning in wooden pails that were carried on the backs of sturdy ponies. The herbs used in the butter varied according to the season and availability, but commonly included parsley, chives and marjoram, each of which contributed its own distinctive flavor to the mixture. The parsley provided a fresh, clean taste that complemented the earthier flavors of the peas, while the chives added a mild onion-like flavor that enhanced the overall complexity of the dish. The marjoram contributed a subtle sweetness that helped to balance the more assertive flavors of the other herbs. The process of making herb butter required careful timing, for the herbs needed to be chopped while they were still fresh, and their essential oils were at their peak concentration, and the butter needed to be soft enough to accept the herbs, but not so warm that it would begin to melt and separate. The chopping of herbs was done with sharp knives on wooden cutting boards that had been scrubbed clean with salt and hot water to remove any traces of previous use that might contaminate the delicate flavors of the fresh herbs. The butter itself came from cream that had been allowed to sour slightly, giving it a tangy flavor that enhanced its ability to accept and hold the flavors of the added herbs. The cream would be churned in wooden churns that were operated by hand, requiring steady rhythm and considerable physical effort to transform the liquid cream into solid butter and liquid buttermilk. The buttermilk that resulted from this process was not wasted, but was used in the preparation of other foods or consumed as a refreshing drink during hot weather. On certain evenings, particularly during feast days or when Master Geoffrey's business had been especially profitable, the apprentices might be served small portions of cheese that had been aged in the caves and cellars of monasteries located in the countryside surrounding London. These cheeses were made from the milk of cows that grazed on pastures that were managed according to ancient agricultural practices, with careful attention to the rotation of grazing areas, and the maintenance of soil fertility through the application of animal manure and vegetable compost. The cheese-making process itself was a complex and time-consuming procedure that required specialized knowledge and equipment, beginning with the careful heating of fresh milk to specific temperatures and the addition of rennet that would cause the milk to separate into curds and whey. The curds would then be pressed in wooden forms that were weighted with stones, allowing the excess whey to drain away while the remaining solids formed into the dense flavorful cheese that would be aged for periods ranging from several months to more than a year. During the aging process, the cheeses would be turned regularly, and their surfaces would be cleaned and treated with various substances that would prevent harmful molds from developing, while encouraging the growth of beneficial bacteria that contributed to the cheese's flavor and texture. The caves and cellars where aging took place were carefully maintained at specific temperatures and humidity levels that were optimal for the slow transformation of the young cheese into the mature product that would eventually reach the tables of London's residents. The cheese that Thomas would eat as an apprentice was usually of the simpler varieties, made with less elaborate aging processes, and sold at prices that were within the reach of workshop households that needed to feed several apprentices along with their masters' families. These cheeses had mild flavors and firm textures that made them suitable for consumption with bread and ale, and they provided valuable protein and fat that supplemented the grains and vegetables that formed the majority of the apprentices' diet. The ale that accompanied the evening meal was brewed according to recipes and techniques that had been developed over centuries of brewing tradition, using barley that had been malted through careful processes of soaking, germinating, and drying that converted the grain starches into fermentable sugars. The malting process required precise control of temperature and moisture, for barley that was malted too quickly would not develop the proper flavors, while barley that was malted too slowly might begin to rot before the process was complete. The malted barley would be ground into coarse meal, using stone querns that were operated by hand or by water power, depending on the size and resources of the brewery that produced the ale consumed in Master Geoffrey's household. The grinding process needed to break open the husks of the barley grains to expose the starchy interior, while avoiding the creation of flour so fine that it would cloud the finished ale, or interfere with the fermentation process. The ground malt would then be mixed with hot water in large wooden vats, where the starches would dissolve into the liquid to create the sweet wort that would serve as the foundation for the brewing process. The temperature of the water used for this mashing process was critical, for water that was too hot would extract bitter compounds from the grain husks, while water that was not hot enough would fail to dissolve the starches properly. After the mashing process was complete, the liquid wort would be separated from the grain solids, and transferred to brewing kettles where it would be boiled with hops that had been grown in the hop gardens of Kent and other counties where the climate and soil conditions were suitable for this specialized crop. The hops served multiple purposes in the brewing process, adding the bitter flavors that balanced the sweetness of the malt while also providing natural preservatives that helped to prevent the ale from spoiling during storage and transport. The boiling process would concentrate the wort and extract the essential oils and bitter compounds from the hops, creating the foundation for ale that would have the proper balance of flavors and the keeping qualities that were necessary for a beverage that might need to be stored for several weeks or months before consumption. The length of the boiling process and the timing of hop additions were carefully controlled according to recipes that had been developed through generations of brewing experience. After boiling, the wort would be cooled and transferred to fermentation vessels where yeast would be added to begin the process of converting the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The yeast used in brewing came from various sources, sometimes purchased from other brewers and sometimes cultivated by the brewery itself through the maintenance of yeast cultures that were passed down from batch to batch. The fermentation process would continue for several days or weeks depending on the desired strength and character of the finished ale. The fermentation vessels were usually made from oak or other hardwoods that had been carefully seasoned and prepared to prevent contamination of the ale with unwanted flavors or harmful bacteria. These vessels required regular cleaning and maintenance, being scrubbed with hot water and salt after each use and inspected for signs of damage or wear that might compromise the quality of future batches of ale. Thomas would drink his ale from a wooden cup that had been carved from a single piece of oak, its interior smooth and its exterior marked with the simple decorative patterns that identified it as belonging to Master Geoffrey's household. The cup held approximately half a pint of ale,
providing sufficient liquid to accompany the evening meal, while avoiding the waste that would result from larger portions that might not be completely consumed. The wooden cup required careful maintenance to preserve its usefulness and prevent it from developing cracks or stains that would make it unsuitable for drinking. After each use, the cup would be rinsed with clean water and wiped dry with a linen cloth, then inspected for any signs of damage that might require repair or replacement. Wooden cups that showed signs of cracking would be retired from use for drinking, and might be used for other purposes in the workshop or kitchen. As the evening meal concluded and the apprentices prepared for sleep, the kitchen would be cleaned and organized for the following day's food preparation, with utensils washed and stored in their proper places and ingredients checked and arranged according to the meals that would be prepared during the coming day. The fire in the kitchen hearth would be banked with ashes to preserve the coals overnight, ensuring that cooking could begin promptly the following morning without the need to restart the fire from scratch. The wooden bowls and spoons used by the apprentices would be scrubbed with sand and hot water to remove all traces of food, then dried thoroughly to prevent the growth of harmful bacteria or mold that could contaminate future meals. The cleaning process required attention to detail, for even small amounts of food residue could spoil and create unpleasant odors or flavors that would affect the palatability of the next day's meals. The earthenware pots and vessels used for storing ingredients would be checked for proper sealing and cleanliness, with their contents examined for signs of spoilage or contamination that might require the disposal of valuable food supplies. Pots containing perishable items would be moved to the coolest areas of the kitchen or storage rooms, where lower temperatures would slow the processes of decay that could destroy the household's carefully accumulated food stores. As Thomas settled onto his straw mattress for the night, his stomach satisfied with the evening's meal of peas porridge and ale, he could hear the gradual quieting of the workshop as Master Geoffrey and the other craftsmen completed their evening tasks and prepared for rest. The sounds of the city beyond the workshop walls would continue throughout the night, with watchmen calling the hours and occasional carts rumbling over the cobblestones as merchants and traders moved their goods through the narrow streets. The rhythms of eating that structured Thomas's days as an apprentice connected him to the larger patterns of agricultural production and seasonal change that governed life in medieval England, from the spring planting of grains and vegetables to the autumn harvest that would determine the availability and price of food throughout the coming winter. Each meal reflected the accumulated knowledge and traditions of countless generations who had learned to transform raw ingredients into nourishing food through processes that remained largely unchanged despite the passage of centuries. The wooden spoon that Thomas used to eat his meals had been carved by craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through guild traditions that preserved not only the techniques of woodworking, but also the understanding of which types of wood were best suited for different purposes, how to season and prepare the wood properly, and how to maintain the finished implements to ensure their longevity and usefulness. The horn from which his spoon was made had been carefully selected for its size and quality, then shaped through patient work with specialized tools that removed material slowly and precisely to create the smooth curves and balanced proportions that made the spoon comfortable to use and effective for consuming different types of food. The linen cloth that was used to clean Thomas's bowl after each meal represented the culmination of agricultural and manufacturing processes that began with the planting of flax seeds in carefully prepared fields, continued through the harvesting and processing of the mature flax plants, and concluded with the spinning and weaving that transformed the processed fibers into useful cloth. Each step in this process required specialized knowledge and skills that were maintained within guild structures that ensured the quality and consistency of the finished products while preserving the techniques that had been developed over generations of craftsmen.
What it was really like to work in a 19th century clock shop. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Pemberton and Sons, casting long shadows across the workbenches, where brass gears and steel springs lay scattered in careful disorder. The year was 1847, and the workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Clerkenwell Road, where the steady tick of dozens of timepieces created a gentle symphony that began before dawn and continued well past the evening hour, when the gas lamps were first lit along the cobbled street outside. Thomas Whitmore adjusted his leather apron and reached for the magnifying glass that hung from a brass chain around his neck, examining the delicate escapement mechanism that had been troubling him since the previous afternoon. The clock before him was a bracket clock, its mahogany case polished to a deep shine, commissioned by a gentleman from Bloomsbury, who required its chimes to sound precisely on the quarter hour. The mechanism itself was a marvel of precision, with each tooth of each gear cut by hand and filed to tolerances, measured in fractions of inches, that had no formal names, but were understood through the accumulated wisdom of fingers that had spent decades learning the resistance of different metals. The workshop contained 7 workbenches, each equipped with a vise, a selection of files ranging from coarse to needle-fine, and an array of specialized tools whose names reflected their particular purposes. There were pivot lathes for turning the tiny axles that allowed gears to rotate smoothly, bow drills operated by drawing a string back and forth to create the rotating motion needed for precise boring, and an assortment of hammers so small that some weighed less than an ounce yet could deliver exactly the force needed to adjust a spring or reshape a brass component that had been formed incorrectly during the initial cutting process. The brass used in the better timepieces arrived at the workshop in sheets and rods, delivered by cart from the foundries that operated along the Thames, where the copper and tin were melted together in proportions that had been refined over generations of metal workers. Each sheet bore the subtle variations in color and texture that indicated the precise mixture of metals, and experienced clockmakers could determine the workability of a particular batch of brass simply by examining how the light played across its surface and feeling the slight differences in weight and density that spoke to the quality of the alloying process. Thomas selected a file with teeth so fine they were barely visible to the naked eye, and began the careful process of adjusting the pallets that controlled the escapement mechanism. Each stroke of the file removed metal measured in thousandths of an inch, and the work proceeded with the methodical patience that characterized all aspects of clockmaking during this period. The sound of filing created a gentle rasping rhythm that blended with the ticking of the completed clocks that lined the walls of the workshop, their pendulums swinging in patterns that were almost but not quite synchronized, creating subtle variations in tempo that experienced clockmakers found soothing rather than distracting. The apprentices arrived as the church bells of St. James were striking 7, their leather tool rolls slung over their shoulders, and their hands already bearing the small cuts and stains that marked their initiation into the craft. Young William Hartwell, in his 2nd year of apprenticeship, was assigned the task of preparing mainsprings, a process that required heating strips of steel to precise temperatures and then tempering them in oil that had been warmed to exactly the right degree. The oil itself was a mixture of whale oil and neat's foot oil, combined in proportions that master clockmakers guarded as carefully as any other trade secret, and the temperature was judged not by thermometer but by observing the color of the heated steel, as it shifted from deep red to cherry red to the pale orange that indicated readiness for the quenching process. The mainspring preparation occupied most of the morning hours, with each spring requiring individual attention as it was shaped into the precise spiral that would store and release the energy needed to drive the clock mechanism. The coiling process itself was performed using a specialized device called a spring barrel, which held the outer end of the spring while the inner end was slowly wound to create the tight spiral configuration. The tension had to be adjusted gradually, with frequent pauses to allow the metal to settle into its new configuration, and to check that the spring was coiling evenly without the binding or irregular spacing that would cause timekeeping problems once the clock was assembled and placed in service. Master Pemberton moved between the workbenches with the unhurried gait of someone who had learned that haste in clockmaking led inevitably to errors that required far more time to correct than would have been saved by rushing the initial work. His hands bore the scars and calluses that accumulated over 4 decades of working with sharp tools and heated metal, and his eyes had developed the ability to detect variations in the surface finish of metal components that would be invisible to those outside the trade. He paused at Thomas's bench to examine the bracket clock, running his finger along the edge of the case where the brass hinges would be mounted, feeling for the slight roughness that would indicate that additional filing was needed before the final fitting could be completed. The brass hinges themselves were cut from sheet metal, using patterns made of stiff paper, traced around with a scribe that left thin lines in the metal surface. Each hinge required 6 separate pieces when completed, and the cutting process involved both shears for the rough shaping and files for the final contouring that would allow the pieces to fit together with the precision required for smooth operation. The pivot pins that connected the hinge sections were made from steel rod that was turned down to exact dimensions on the pivot lathe,
with each pin requiring measurement with calipers to ensure that it would fit snugly in the holes that had been carefully drilled to receive them. The drilling process itself required particular care, as the brass was soft enough to allow the drill bit to grab and tear the metal if too much pressure was applied or if the drilling speed was not properly controlled. The bow drill was operated with smooth, steady strokes that maintained consistent rotational speed, while the clockmaker applied gentle downward pressure with one hand and used the other to guide the drill bit precisely to the marked center point of each hole. The drilling proceeded slowly, with frequent withdrawals of the bit to clear away brass shavings that might otherwise cause the hole to become oversized or irregularly shaped. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the quality of light in the workshop gradually changed, shifting from the clear illumination of early morning to the softer, more diffused light that filtered through windows increasingly obscured by the coal smoke that rose from the countless chimneys throughout the district. The clockmakers adjusted to these changes without conscious thought, moving their work closer to the windows when detail work required the clearest possible illumination, and shifting to tasks that could be completed by feel and sound when the light began to fade toward evening. The sound environment of the workshop was as carefully regulated as any other aspect of the work. The ticking of the completed clocks provided a constant background rhythm, but master clockmakers had learned to distinguish between the sounds that indicated proper operation and those subtle variations in tone or timing that suggested developing problems. A clock whose pendulum was beginning to bind might produce a tick that was fractionally shorter than normal, while a mainspring that was losing tension would cause a gradual slowing that could be detected by ear long before it became visible in the clock's timekeeping performance. Thomas completed the escapement adjustment in the early afternoon and began the process of reassembling the bracket clock mechanism, working from the base plate upward through the increasingly complex arrangement of gears, springs, and levers that transformed the steady release of energy from the mainspring into the precise movements of the hour and minute hands. Each component had to be positioned exactly, with the gear trains aligned so that the ratios between different wheels produced the correct relationship between the various hands and the striking mechanism that would sound the hours and quarter hours. The gear teeth themselves were cut using specialized files that were drawn along the edge of each gear wheel while the wheel was held in a device called a gear cutting rest. This process required multiple passes with progressively finer files, beginning with a coarse file that established the basic tooth shape and progressing through intermediate and finishing files that refined the profile and surface finish of each tooth. The depth of each cut was controlled by careful manipulation of the file angle and pressure, with experienced clockmakers able to achieve remarkably consistent results despite the entirely manual nature of the process. The striking train required particularly careful adjustment as it had to be synchronized not only with the timekeeping portion of the mechanism but also with the complex system of cams and levers that determined the number of strikes for each hour. The hour cam was a stepped wheel with 12 different levels, each corresponding to one of the 12 hours, and the striking hammer had to fall exactly the right number of times as the cam rotated through each position. The adjustment process involved repeated testing, with the clock mechanism advanced manually through complete 12-hour cycles while the clockmaker listened to ensure that each hour struck the correct number of times, and that the quarter-hour chimes sounded at precisely the right intervals. The hammers that struck the bells or gongs were shaped from steel rod that had been carefully forged to provide the proper balance between hardness and resilience. Too hard, and the hammer would produce a harsh metallic tone that would be unpleasant to hear. Too soft and the hammer would deform over time and fail to produce clear, consistent striking sounds. The forging process involved heating the steel to orange heat and then shaping it using small hammers and anvils, with the final forming accomplished using files and emery cloth to achieve the smooth surfaces and precise dimensions required for proper operation. The brass used in the gear trains was selected not only for its working properties but also for its appearance, as many clock mechanisms were designed to be partially visible through glass panels in the case. The brass was polished using increasingly fine abrasives, beginning with pumice powder mixed with oil and progressing through successively finer polishing compounds until the metal surfaces achieved the mirror-like finish that was expected in better quality timepieces. The polishing process was performed using soft leather pads, with each surface requiring individual attention and frequent examination to ensure that the polishing marks were running in consistent directions and that no scratches or other imperfections remained visible. The polishing operation began with the coarsest abrasive, typically pumice stone, that had been ground to a fine powder and mixed with light machine oil to create a paste of workable consistency. This mixture was applied to leather pads that had been stretched over wooden blocks shaped to conform to the surfaces being polished. The polishing motion was circular at first to remove the file marks and other surface irregularities left by previous operations, and then shifted to straight line strokes in the final stages to produce the uniform surface finish that characterized high-quality work. Between each stage of polishing, the brass components were thoroughly cleaned using soft brushes and mild soap solutions to remove all traces of the abrasive compounds that had been used in the previous step. Any residual abrasive would contaminate the finer polishing compounds and prevent the achievement of the mirror finish that was the goal of the entire process. The cleaning operation itself required careful attention, as the brass surfaces could be easily scratched by particles of grit that might be embedded in the cleaning brushes or cloths. The casework represented a separate specialty within the clock-making trade, requiring skills in cabinet making and wood finishing that complemented but were distinct from the mechanical aspects of clock construction. The mahogany used in better cases was selected for both its working properties and its appearance, with preference given to wood that showed the tight, even grain patterns that would accept stain and polish uniformly. The wood arrived at the workshop in boards that had been air-dried for several years. An additional seasoning in the workshop environment was often required to ensure that the wood would remain stable after the case was completed and placed in service. The selection process for case wood involved examining each board for defects that might cause problems during construction or in service. Knots, splits, and areas of irregular grain were carefully marked and avoided when laying out the cutting patterns for individual case components. The wood was also checked for moisture content by examining the end grain and testing the weight of sample pieces, as wood that retained too much moisture would continue to shrink after the case was completed, potentially causing joints to loosen or panels to warp. The joinery used in case construction relied on traditional cabinet making techniques, with mortise and tenon joints secured using hide glue that was prepared fresh each morning by heating glue chips in a double boiler until they dissolved into a smooth, workable consistency. The glue had to be applied at exactly the right temperature, warm enough to flow smoothly into the joint but not so hot that it would begin to set before the joint could be properly assembled and clamped. The clamping process itself required careful attention to pressure and alignment, with wooden cauls used to distribute clamping pressure evenly and prevent the concentrated forces that might cause the wood to split or the joint to slip out of proper alignment. The preparation of hide glue began each morning with the selection of glue chips from the supply barrel, examining each piece for signs of deterioration or contamination that might affect the strength or working properties of the dissolved glue. The selected chips were placed in the inner pot of the double boiler and covered with clean water, then allowed to soak for several hours until they had absorbed sufficient moisture to begin dissolving when heat was applied. The heating process was gradual and controlled, with frequent stirring to ensure even dissolution and to prevent the formation of lumps that would create weak spots in the finished joints. The brass fittings used on clock cases were often made in the workshop rather than purchased from suppliers, allowing for the precise fitting and custom proportions that distinguished high-quality work from more ordinary production. Hinges, escutcheons and corner pieces were cut from sheet brass using the same techniques employed for the mechanical components, with careful attention to the thickness and temper of the metal. The brass was often given decorative treatments, including engraving performed with sharp steel tools called gravers that cut fine lines into the metal surface, creating patterns that ranged from simple geometric designs to elaborate pictorial compositions that required considerable artistic skill to execute properly. The engraving process began with the preparation of the brass surface, which was polished to a high finish and then coated with a thin layer of wax or varnish that would make the engraved lines more visible during the cutting process. The design was first sketched on paper and then transferred to the brass surface using carbon paper or by pricking through the paper with a sharp point to create a series of dots that could be connected to form the desired pattern. The actual engraving was performed using gravers of various shapes and sizes, each designed for specific types of cuts and line characteristics. The graver itself was essentially a sharp steel chisel with a wooden handle, available in different profiles that produced lines of varying width and depth. The cutting edge was maintained at a precise angle through frequent sharpening on fine whetstones, and the graver was held in a specific grip that allowed for precise control of both direction and depth of cut. The engraving proceeded slowly and deliberately, with each line planned and executed as a single continuous stroke whenever possible to ensure smoothness and consistency of appearance. As the afternoon light began to fade, the clockmakers lit the oil lamps that provided illumination for detail work during the darker hours. The lamps burned whale oil, which produced a steady, relatively smokeless flame that was preferred for precision work over the more common tallow candles that were used for general lighting. The lamp wicks required frequent trimming to maintain proper flame characteristics, and the oil reservoirs had to be refilled regularly to ensure consistent illumination throughout the evening working hours. The whale oil used in the workshop lamps was purchased from suppliers who specialized in providing the highest grades of oil for precision applications. The oil was stored in sealed containers to prevent contamination and oxidation, and each lamp was filled using a funnel with a fine mesh strainer that removed any particles or impurities that might cause smoking or irregular flame behavior. The wicks themselves were made from tightly braided cotton fibers that had been treated with salt solutions to promote even burning and reduce the formation of carbon deposits that would require frequent trimming. The day's production was recorded in ledger books that tracked both the progress of individual timepieces and the consumption of materials and supplies. Each entry included details about the work performed, materials used, and time required, creating records that served both for billing customers and for tracking the efficiency of different working methods. The ledgers also included notes about special techniques or modifications that had been employed to solve particular problems, creating an accumulated knowledge base that could be consulted when similar challenges arose in future work. The record-keeping system extended beyond simple production tracking to include detailed notes about the performance characteristics of different suppliers and materials. Brass from certain foundries might be noted as being particularly well suited for gear cutting, while steel from other sources might be preferred for springs or other components requiring specific properties. These observations were accumulated over years of experience and represented valuable knowledge that could significantly affect the quality and efficiency of future production. The brass filings and other metal waste generated during the day's work were carefully collected and stored for eventual return to the foundries, where they would be melted down and incorporated into new metal stock. Even the finest brass dust had value, and experienced clockmakers developed habits of working over leather aprons or cloth that could be shaken out to capture every particle of metal that might otherwise be lost to the workshop floor. The collected filings were sorted by type of metal and stored in labeled containers that were periodically exchanged with the suppliers for credit toward future purchases of raw materials. The steel filings generated during the preparation of springs and other steel components were handled separately, as they required different processing methods when being recycled into new stock. Steel filings were more susceptible to oxidation than brass, and had to be kept dry and protected from moisture to prevent rust formation that would contaminate the recycled metal. The storage containers for steel waste were lined with oiled cloth and equipped with tight-fitting lids that excluded air and moisture during the sometimes lengthy periods between collections. As evening approached and the natural light faded from the workshop windows, the pace of work gradually shifted toward tasks that could be performed effectively under lamplight. Detail work requiring the clearest possible vision was typically completed during the afternoon hours, while evening activities focused on operations that could be guided more by touch and sound than by precise visual examination. The filing of gear teeth, for example, was often continued into the evening hours, as experienced clockmakers could judge the progress of the work by the feel of the file and the sound it made as it cut through the metal. The evening hours also provided opportunities for maintenance activities that were essential to keeping the workshop tools and equipment in proper working condition. Files were cleaned using wire brushes to remove metal particles that had become embedded in the cutting teeth, and the cutting edges were restored using special file cards that scraped away the accumulated debris without damaging the file structure. Lathes and other machinery were oiled and adjusted, with particular attention to the bearings and sliding surfaces that required regular lubrication to maintain smooth operation and prevent premature wear. The oil used for tool maintenance was different from that used in the lamps, being heavier and more viscous to provide better lubrication properties and longer service life. This lubricating oil was applied sparingly using small brushes or oiling cans equipped with fine spouts that allowed precise placement of the oil exactly where it was needed. Excess oil was carefully wiped away, as it would attract dust and metal particles that could interfere with the smooth operation of the tools and might transfer to clock components during subsequent work sessions. The workbenches themselves required regular attention to maintain the level surfaces and secure mounting of visors and other fixtures that were essential for precision work. The wooden bench tops were periodically refinished using fine sandpaper and linseed oil, restoring the smooth surfaces that allowed delicate components to be handled without risk of damage from splinters or rough spots. The visors were disassembled and cleaned, with particular attention to the screw threads that controlled jaw movement and the guiding surfaces that ensured proper alignment of the jaws under clamping pressure. The storage and organization of the countless small components and subassemblies that were in various stages of completion required systematic approaches that had been developed through years of experience with the challenges of managing complex production processes. Components were sorted by size, material, and stage of completion, with each category assigned to specific drawers or compartments that were clearly labeled to prevent confusion and misplacement. The labeling system included not only the identity of the components but also notes about their intended application and any special handling requirements that might affect their subsequent processing. The inventory of raw materials was managed with equal care, as the variety of different metals, alloys and specifications required for clock production meant that substantial quantities of materials had to be kept in stock to ensure uninterrupted production. Brass sheet and rod were stored in racks that protected them from damage while allowing easy access for cutting and shaping operations. Steel stock was kept in separate storage areas and protected from moisture to prevent rust formation, while specialized materials such as the various grades of steel used for springs were stored in carefully controlled conditions that preserved their metallurgical properties until they were needed for production use. The workshop gradually settled into the quieter rhythms of evening work as the apprentices completed their assigned tasks and began the cleaning and organizing activities that concluded each working day. Tools were returned to their designated storage locations, workbenches were cleared of debris and swept clean, and the oil lamps were trimmed and refilled in preparation for the following day's activities. The completed work of the day was carefully examined and documented, with notes made about any aspects that would require attention during subsequent work sessions. The steady ticking of the completed timepieces continued through the evening hours, creating the gentle background rhythm that had become such a familiar part of the workshop environment that its absence would have been immediately noticed by anyone who worked there regularly. The various clocks were not synchronized with each other, having been adjusted to keep accurate time rather than to tick in unison, and the resulting pattern of overlapping rhythms created a complex but soothing sound environment that seemed to encourage the careful, methodical approach that characterized all aspects of clock making during this period. The brass components that had been polished during the day were carefully wrapped in soft cloth and stored in dust-proof containers to protect their mirror-like surfaces from the gradual accumulation of tarnish that would dull their appearance over time. The wrapping process itself required care to ensure that the cloth did not leave lint or other residues on the polished surfaces, and the storage containers were checked regularly to ensure that they remained clean and dry. The investment in time and effort required to achieve the high-quality finishes meant that protecting them from deterioration was an important consideration in the workshop's daily routine.
Why you'd struggle with a job at the 1800s post office. The morning bell at the General Post Office on St. Paul's Churchyard struck 6 precisely as William Hartwell pushed through the heavy oak doors that led into the sorting hall. His leather satchel, containing the day's allocation of stamps, sealing wax, and the small metal ruler that would measure countless letters and parcels before the evening's final dispatch. The year was 1853, and the postal service had recently undergone the great reform that introduced the penny post, fundamentally altering not only the cost of sending correspondence, but the entire system of procedures that governed how mail was processed, sorted, and delivered throughout the expanding network of post offices that now connected even the smallest villages to the great commercial centers of the realm. The sorting hall stretched the full length of the building's ground floor, its whitewashed walls lined with wooden pigeonhole frames that rose from floor to ceiling, each compartment precisely labeled with destinations written in the careful copperplate script that all postal clerks were required to master before beginning their duties. The pigeonholes were arranged according to a complex geographical system that divided the country into postal districts, with primary sorting categories for major cities and towns, secondary categories for smaller communities, and tertiary categories for rural districts that might receive mail only twice weekly, depending on the season and the condition of the roads that connected them to the main postal routes. William took his assigned position at sorting table number 14, where a canvas sack containing approximately 300 letters awaited his attention. Each letter required individual examination to determine its proper destination, verify that sufficient postage had been paid, and check for any irregularities in addressing or preparation that might prevent delivery. The examination process began with a careful reading of the address, written in inks that varied from the deep black of expensive writing fluid to the pale brown of makeshift solutions concocted from oak galls and iron filings by correspondents who could not afford better materials. The handwriting itself presented constant challenges, as correspondence represented every level of education and social position, from the careful penmanship of professional scribes to the labored efforts of barely literate individuals who struggled to form recognizable letters. Postal clerks developed the ability to decipher even the most challenging handwriting through experience and systematic study of regional variations in letter formation and spelling conventions. Certain districts were known for particular characteristics in their correspondence, such as the tendency of Yorkshire correspondents to use distinctive abbreviations, or the preference of Scottish writers for certain archaic spellings that had fallen out of use elsewhere. The addressing conventions themselves had evolved over generations of postal service, with specific requirements for the order and placement of different elements within the address. The recipient's name appeared first, followed by their street address or other identifying location, then the town or city, and finally the county or other administrative division. However, these conventions were not universally understood or followed, and postal clerks frequently encountered letters with incomplete, incorrect, or ambiguous addressing that required considerable detective work to resolve. Street numbering systems were particularly problematic, as many communities had adopted numbering schemes relatively recently and inconsistently. Some streets numbered houses consecutively from one end to the other, while others used odd numbers on one side and even numbers on the other. Certain districts employed letter designations in addition to or instead of numbers, and some areas relied entirely on house names rather than any numerical system. Postal clerks maintained detailed knowledge of these local variations and kept reference materials that documented the addressing peculiarities of different communities within their sorting areas. The verification of postage required examining each letter for evidence that the proper fee had been paid, either through the application of adhesive stamps or through prepayment arrangements that were indicated by specific markings applied by the originating post office. The penny post had simplified this process considerably by establishing a uniform rate for letters meeting certain size and weight requirements, but exceptions and special cases remained numerous. Letters exceeding the standard weight limit required additional postage, calculated according to complex schedules that varied depending on the destination and the class of service requested. The weighing process itself was performed using sensitive balance scales that were calibrated daily using standard weights maintained specifically for postal use. Each letter was placed on one side of the balance while weights were added to the other side until equilibrium was achieved, allowing the postal clerk to determine whether additional postage was required. The scales were delicate instruments that required careful handling and regular maintenance to ensure accuracy, as even small variations in their calibration could result in incorrect postage assessments that might cause delays or additional charges for recipients. Letters that were found to be improperly addressed or insufficiently stamped were set aside for special handling procedures that might involve attempting to contact the sender, forwarding the correspondence to a central office for further investigation, or in some cases returning the letter to its point of origin. These exceptional cases required detailed documentation,
with clerks maintaining logbooks that recorded the nature of each problem, the actions taken to resolve it, and the final disposition of the correspondence. The logbooks served both as administrative records and as reference materials that could be consulted when similar problems arose in the future. The sorting process itself followed strict protocols that had been developed through years of experience with the challenges of managing large volumes of mail efficiently and accurately. Letters were first divided into broad geographical categories corresponding to major postal districts, then subdivided into increasingly specific destination groups until each piece of mail was assigned to the appropriate delivery route. This hierarchical sorting system allowed large volumes of mail to be processed systematically, while minimizing the risk of misdirection or delay. The physical arrangement of the sorting operation was designed to facilitate smooth workflow and minimize the time required to process each piece of mail. Clerks worked at long tables equipped with multiple sorting boxes, each labeled with specific destinations and arranged in logical geographical order. As each letter was examined and its destination determined, it was placed in the appropriate box, gradually accumulating into bundles that would be tied with string and labeled for dispatch to their respective destinations. The string used for bundling mail was hemp cord of specified thickness and strength, supplied by contractors who met strict quality standards established by the Postal Administration. The cord had to be strong enough to secure bundles of letters during transport while being thin enough not to add excessive bulk or weight to the mail packets. The tying process itself required specific knots that would hold securely under normal handling conditions but could be quickly undone by postal workers at destination offices. Each bundle of mail was labeled with a paper tag that indicated its destination, the number of pieces it contained, and the date and time of dispatch. These tags were prepared using forms printed specifically for postal use, with spaces for entering the required information in standardized formats that could be quickly read and understood by postal workers throughout the system. The tags were attached to bundles using thin wire or string, positioned so that the information remained visible even when bundles were packed tightly into mail bags for transport. The mail bags themselves were constructed of heavy canvas treated with waterproofing compounds to protect their contents from moisture during transport. Each bag was equipped with brass grommets and rope closures that could be sealed with wax stamps bearing the official postal seal, providing security against tampering and allowing postal officials to verify that bags had not been opened improperly during transit. The bags were available in several sizes to accommodate different volumes of mail and different transportation methods, from small bags suitable for horseback delivery to large bags designed for transport by mail coach or railway. The sealing process required heating sealing wax over a small flame until it reached the proper consistency for application, then dripping the molten wax onto the closure points of mail bags and immediately pressing the official seal into the warm wax to create an impression that would harden as the wax cooled. The sealing wax was a mixture of shellac, rosin and various coloring agents that produced a hard tamper-evident seal that would show clear evidence of any attempt to break or alter it. Different colored waxes were used to indicate different classes of mail or different levels of security, with red wax typically reserved for the most important or sensitive correspondence. The daily schedule of postal operations was precisely regulated by timetables that coordinated the arrival and departure of mail with the schedules of coaches, ships and railway trains that transported correspondence between different parts of the postal network. These timetables were updated regularly to reflect changes in transportation schedules and were distributed to all post offices to ensure that mail processing activities were properly synchronized with available transport opportunities. Morning mail arrival typically occurred between 7 and 8 o'clock when overnight mail coaches and early trains brought correspondence from distant locations. This incoming mail required immediate sorting and processing to ensure that local deliveries could be completed during the morning delivery rounds. The volume of incoming mail varied considerably depending on the day of the week and the season, with Monday mornings typically bringing the heaviest loads due to weekend accumulation, and periods around major holidays producing exceptional volumes that required additional staff and extended working hours. The sorting clerks worked in teams of 6 to 8 individuals, each responsible for specific geographical areas or types of correspondence. Team coordination was essential to ensure that mail was processed efficiently, and that no items were overlooked or misdirected. Experienced clerks served as team leaders, supervising less experienced workers and making decisions about difficult or unusual cases that required special handling. The team structure also provided redundancy, allowing operations to continue smoothly even when individual clerks were absent due to illness or other circumstances. Training new postal clerks required several months of supervised instruction, during which trainees learned not only the specific procedures and regulations governing mail handling, but also the geographical knowledge necessary to sort correspondence accurately. This geographical training included memorizing the names and locations of thousands of communities, understanding the relationships between different postal districts, and learning the transportation routes and schedules that determined how mail moved through the postal system. The memorization process was aided by printed reference materials including detailed maps, alphabetical lists of communities with their postal district assignments, and charts showing the relationships between different levels of the postal hierarchy. Trainees were required to demonstrate their knowledge through written examinations that tested both their ability to sort mail accurately and their understanding of postal regulations and procedures. Only after passing these examinations were new clerks permitted to work independently on mail sorting operations. The physical demands of postal work were considerable, requiring clerks to stand for long periods while handling thousands of individual pieces of mail each day. The repetitive motions involved in examining, sorting, and bundling mail could cause fatigue and strain, particularly during periods of heavy mail volume. Postal workers developed techniques for organizing their work areas and managing their physical movements to minimize fatigue and maintain accuracy throughout long working shifts. The working environment of the post office was carefully controlled to protect both the mail and the workers from adverse conditions. Heating was provided by coal-fired stoves that were tended regularly to maintain comfortable temperatures without creating excessive heat that might damage correspondence or make working conditions unbearable. Ventilation was managed through windows and vents that could be opened or closed depending on weather conditions and the need to maintain air quality in spaces where large numbers of people worked closely together. Lighting was provided by gas lamps during evening hours and supplemented by oil lamps when additional illumination was needed for detailed work. The quality of light was particularly important for examining handwritten addresses and detecting irregularities in postage or addressing that might require special attention. Clerks learned to position their work to take advantage of the best available light and to recognize the signs of eye strain that indicated the need for rest or a change in working position. The security of mail was a constant concern, with procedures designed to prevent theft, loss, or damage to correspondence during processing and transport. Valuable letters and packages were handled separately from ordinary mail, with additional documentation and security measures that tracked their movement through the postal system. Money letters, which contained currency or other valuable items, required special handling procedures that included multiple signatures, sealed containers, and separate transport arrangements. Record-keeping requirements were extensive, with clerks maintaining detailed logs of mail volumes, delivery times, problem cases, and various other aspects of postal operations. These records served multiple purposes, including administrative oversight, quality control, and planning for future capacity needs. The record-keeping system also provided accountability, allowing postal officials to trace the handling of specific pieces of mail and to identify the source of any problems that might arise during processing or delivery. The evening dispatch procedures began in mid-afternoon, when outgoing mail was assembled into bundles, packed into mail bags, and prepared for transport to other post offices. This process required careful attention to transportation schedules and routing, as mail destined for different locations might travel by different routes or depart at different times. Clerks maintained detailed knowledge of transportation options and schedules, allowing them to select the most efficient routing for each piece of mail. The final inspection of outgoing mail involved checking that bundles were properly tied and labeled, that mail bags were correctly packed and sealed, and that all required documentation was complete and accurate. This inspection process was typically performed by senior clerks who had the experience and authority to resolve any problems that might be discovered during the final review. Problems identified during final inspection might require reprocessing portions of the mail, potentially causing delays that could affect delivery schedules. Mail coaches and railway mail cars were loaded according to specific procedures that ensured efficient handling at destination points while maintaining security during transport. Heavy mail bags were loaded first, positioned to provide a stable foundation for lighter bags that were placed on top. The loading process was supervised by postal officials who verified that the correct bags were being loaded onto each transport vehicle, and that all security seals were properly applied and documented. The complexity of routing decisions increased significantly for mail destined for international destinations, which required knowledge of shipping schedules, customs requirements, and international postal treaties that governed the exchange of mail between different countries. International mail was typically processed through specialized departments within major post offices, staffed by clerks who had additional training in the procedures and regulations governing international correspondence. Package mail presented additional challenges due to the variety of sizes, shapes, and weights that had to be accommodated within the postal system. Packages required individual examination to verify proper addressing and postage, and they had to be packed carefully to prevent damage during transport. Fragile items required special packing materials and handling procedures, while valuable packages needed additional security measures similar to those used for money letters. The seasonal variations in mail volume required flexible staffing arrangements that could accommodate periods of heavy demand without maintaining excessive personnel during slower periods. The Christmas season brought particularly heavy mail volumes, requiring the hiring of temporary workers and the extension of working hours to handle the increased load. Postal officials maintained detailed records of seasonal patterns to help with planning and resource allocation for future years. Rural mail delivery presented unique challenges due to the distances involved and the irregular schedules required to serve scattered communities efficiently. Rural postal routes were typically served by horseback riders or small coaches that traveled predetermined circuits, collecting and delivering mail according to schedules that balanced efficiency with the practical limitations of travel over poor roads and difficult terrain. Weather conditions could significantly affect rural delivery schedules, particularly during winter months when snow and ice made travel hazardous or impossible. The postal savings system, which allowed customers to deposit money at post offices for safekeeping and transfer, required additional procedures and record keeping that went beyond simple mail handling. Postal clerks who handled savings transactions needed training in bookkeeping and accounting procedures, and they were held accountable for the accuracy of financial records and the security of deposited funds. The savings system required coordination between multiple post offices when customers wished to make deposits or withdrawals at locations other than their home office. Telegraph services, which were often operated through post offices, represented another layer of complexity in postal operations. Telegraph messages required immediate attention and special handling procedures that took priority over ordinary mail processing. Telegraph operators needed specialized training in the use of telegraph equipment and the encoding and decoding of messages, and they had to be available during extended hours to handle urgent communications that might arrive at any time of day or night. The physical maintenance of post office facilities was an ongoing responsibility that required attention to everything from keeping floors clean and workspaces organized to maintaining heating systems and ensuring that equipment remained in proper working order. Postal workers were expected to contribute to these maintenance activities as part of their regular duties, and they were held accountable for the condition and security of the facilities and equipment under their care. The afternoon brought a different category of challenges as the second delivery of the day arrived from the railway terminus, consisting primarily of commercial correspondence and official government communications that required specialized handling procedures. Commercial mail often arrived in large volumes from major business centers, with individual firms sometimes sending hundreds of letters and circulars that had to be sorted according to increasingly complex addressing schemes as cities expanded and new districts were established. The growth of commercial activity had led to the development of specialized postal services for business customers, including bulk mailing procedures and reduced rates for large volume senders who could meet specific requirements for sorting and preparation of their correspondence. Government mail presented its own unique challenges, as official correspondence often carried special markings or routing instructions that required familiarity with administrative procedures and governmental organization. Military mail, diplomatic correspondence and communications between different levels of government administration each had specific handling requirements that postal clerks had to master through additional training and experience. The security considerations for government mail were particularly stringent, with procedures designed to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive information, and to maintain clear documentation of who had handled each piece of correspondence during its journey through the postal system. The identification of government mail was facilitated by the use of official seals, special papers and distinctive addressing conventions that distinguished such correspondence from ordinary letters. However, the interpretation of these markings required considerable knowledge of governmental organization and procedures, as different departments and agencies used varying systems of identification and routing codes. Postal clerks who specialized in government mail maintained detailed reference materials that documented the proper handling procedures for different types of official correspondence. The sorting of commercial mail required understanding of business districts and commercial establishments within major cities, as well as knowledge of trade routes and commercial relationships that might affect the routing of business correspondence. Large commercial firms often maintained multiple locations, and their mail might be addressed to specific departments or individuals within complex organizational structures. Postal clerks developed familiarity with major commercial establishments within their service areas, learning to recognize common addressing patterns and routing requirements that could expedite the processing of business mail. Package handling procedures became increasingly complex as the volume and variety of packages increased throughout the mid-19th century. The growth of commercial activity and improvements in transportation had made it practical to ship a wider range of goods through the postal system, but this expansion required the development of new procedures for handling items that differed significantly from traditional letter mail. Packages required individual examination to verify proper addressing and postage calculation, and they had to be inspected for prohibited items or materials that might pose safety risks during transport. The inspection process for packages involved opening suspicious or improperly sealed items to verify their contents, a procedure that required careful documentation to maintain accountability and prevent accusations of tampering or theft. Postal regulations specified certain categories of items that could not be shipped through the mail system, including hazardous materials, perishable goods that might spoil during transport, and items of excessive value that required special security arrangements. The identification of prohibited items required experience and judgment, as the external appearance of packages often provided few clues about their actual contents. Fragile packages required special packing materials and handling procedures to prevent damage during the rough handling that was inevitable during transport by coach, rail or ship. The Postal Service maintained supplies of packing materials including straw, wood shavings and cotton wadding that could be used to cushion delicate items, but the use of these materials had to be balanced against the additional weight and bulk that increased shipping costs. Postal clerks learned to assess the packaging requirements for different types of items and to recommend appropriate packing methods to customers who were shipping fragile or valuable goods. The calculation of postage for packages was considerably more complex than for letters, as rates were based on both weight and distance, with additional charges for special handling requirements or expedited delivery services. The Postal Service maintained detailed rate schedules that specified charges for different weight categories and destination zones, but the application of these schedules required careful measurement and calculation to ensure that proper charges were assessed. Errors in postage calculation could result in delays, additional charges for recipients or financial losses for the Postal Service. Weighing procedures for packages required more sophisticated equipment than the simple balance scales used for letters, as packages could weigh many pounds and required accurate measurement to determine proper postage charges. The Postal Service used platform scales that could accommodate large packages while maintaining the accuracy needed for proper rate calculation. These scales required regular calibration and maintenance to ensure accuracy, and postal clerks were trained in their proper use and care.
The documentation requirements for package mail were more extensive than for letters, with detailed records maintained of each package's weight, dimensions, destination, and postage charges. These records served multiple purposes, including verification of proper postage payment, tracking of packages during transport, and resolution of customer complaints or claims for lost or damaged items. The record-keeping system for packages required careful attention to detail and legible handwriting, as the information might need to be consulted months or even years after the original transaction. International package mail presented additional complications due to customs requirements and international postal treaties that governed the exchange of packages between different countries. Packages destined for foreign countries required customs declarations that specified the contents and value of shipped items, and they were subject to inspection by customs officials at both the point of origin and the destination. The preparation of customs documentation required knowledge of international regulations and procedures that went beyond the expertise of ordinary postal clerks. The evening hours brought the final sorting and dispatch procedures that would determine whether mail reached its intended destinations according to established schedules. The pressure to complete processing within strict time limits was balanced against the need to maintain accuracy and prevent errors that could cause delays or misdirection of correspondence. Experienced postal clerks developed the ability to work quickly while maintaining the attention to detail required for accurate mail processing. The preparation of mail for evening dispatch required coordination between different departments within the post office, as letters, packages, and special mail categories had to be consolidated and prepared for transport according to the schedules and capacity limitations of available transportation services. Mail coaches had limited capacity and weight restrictions that required careful planning to ensure that all mail could be accommodated without exceeding the practical limitations of horse-drawn transport. Railway mail service had introduced new possibilities for rapid transport of large volumes of mail, but it also required coordination with railway schedules and procedures that were controlled by transportation companies rather than postal officials. The timing of mail preparation had to be synchronized with train departures, and contingency plans had to be maintained for occasions when railway schedules were disrupted by weather, mechanical problems, or other unforeseen circumstances. The loading procedures for railway mail cars required specific arrangements to ensure that mail bags were properly secured during transport and that they could be efficiently unloaded at destination points. Railway mail cars were equipped with sorting facilities that allowed postal clerks to continue processing mail during transport, but this required careful coordination between the postal service and railway companies to ensure that appropriate personnel and equipment were available for en route mail processing. Ship mail service for overseas destinations required even more complex coordination, as sailing schedules were dependent on weather conditions and tidal factors that could not be precisely predicted. Mail destined for overseas destinations was typically held at major ports until suitable shipping opportunities became available, and postal officials maintained detailed knowledge of shipping schedules and routes to ensure that mail was routed efficiently to its international destinations. The security requirements for mail transport were particularly stringent for valuable mail and government correspondence, with procedures designed to prevent theft or unauthorized access during the vulnerable periods when mail was being transported between different locations. Mail coaches and railway mail cars were equipped with secure compartments and locking mechanisms, and postal employees who handled valuable mail were bonded and subject to background investigations to ensure their reliability and trustworthiness. The coordination of mail transport with local delivery services required detailed knowledge of delivery routes and schedules within each community served by the postal system. Local delivery routes were designed to provide efficient coverage of residential and commercial areas while minimizing the time and distance required for postal carriers to complete their assigned routes. The planning of delivery routes required careful consideration of geographical factors, population density, and the volume of mail typically delivered to different areas.
Rural delivery routes presented particular challenges due to the long distances and difficult terrain that had to be covered to serve scattered communities and individual farms. Rural postal carriers often traveled on horseback or in small carts, carrying mailbags and packages over routes that might cover 50 miles or more in a single day. The scheduling of rural deliveries had to account for seasonal variations in road conditions and weather that could significantly affect travel times and the safety of postal carriers. The winter months brought special challenges for mail transport and delivery, as snow and ice made travel hazardous and sometimes impossible. Postal officials maintained emergency procedures for handling mail during severe weather conditions, including arrangements for temporary storage of mail that could not be delivered according to normal schedules. The accumulation of undelivered mail during extended periods of severe weather required additional storage space and personnel to handle the backlog once normal operations could be resumed. The spring thaw often brought flooding that could disrupt mail transport routes and damage postal facilities, requiring contingency plans for maintaining mail service during periods when normal transportation routes were impassable. Postal officials maintained detailed knowledge of alternative routes and transportation methods that could be employed during emergencies, and they coordinated with local authorities and transportation companies to ensure that mail service could be maintained despite adverse conditions. The training and supervision of postal employees required ongoing attention to ensure that service standards were maintained and that new procedures were properly implemented throughout the postal system. Postal inspectors traveled regularly between different post offices to verify that proper procedures were being followed and to investigate complaints or problems that might indicate deficiencies in service quality. The inspection process included examination of records, observation of work procedures, and testing of employee knowledge of postal regulations and procedures. The career advancement system within the Postal Service provided opportunities for experienced clerks to move into supervisory positions or to transfer to specialized departments that handled particular types of mail or services. Advancement was typically based on demonstrated competence, length of service, and performance on examinations that tested knowledge of postal procedures and regulations. The examination system ensured that supervisory personnel had the knowledge and skills necessary to maintain service quality and to train less experienced employees. The interaction with customers represented a significant portion of postal work, as clerks were responsible for explaining postal procedures, calculating postage charges, and resolving problems that might arise with mail service. Customer service required patience and diplomacy, as postal patrons often had limited understanding of postal procedures and might become frustrated when their expectations could not be met within existing regulations and capabilities. Postal clerks developed skills in explaining complex procedures in simple terms and in finding solutions to customer problems within the constraints of postal regulations. The handling of customer complaints required careful documentation and investigation to determine the facts of each case and to identify appropriate remedies when postal service had not met established standards. Complaint resolution procedures were designed to be fair and thorough while maintaining the efficiency of postal operations and preventing abuse of the complaint system by unreasonable customers. The documentation of complaints and their resolution provided valuable feedback for improving postal procedures and identifying areas where additional training or procedural changes might be needed. The financial aspects of postal operations required careful attention to revenue collection, expense control, and the prevention of fraud or theft that could affect the financial integrity of the postal system. Postal clerks were responsible for collecting postage payments, maintaining accurate records of revenue, and ensuring that postal funds were properly secured and accounted for. The handling of postal revenue required bonding of employees and regular auditing procedures to verify that financial controls were being properly maintained. As the final evening dispatch approached and the last mail bags were sealed and loaded onto waiting coaches and railway cars, the postal clerks completed their daily contribution to the vast network of communications that connected every corner of the realm, ensuring that correspondence, commerce, and government could function efficiently despite the geographical barriers that had once made rapid communication impossible. While maintaining the careful attention to detail and adherence to procedure that made reliable mail service possible, even as the volume and complexity of postal operations continued to grow with each passing year.
How medieval students took notes without paper. Brother Geoffrey adjusted his position on the wooden bench, the rough-hewn surface having grown familiar through countless hours of study in the scriptorium of Canterbury Cathedral, where the morning light filtered through narrow windows of horn and oiled parchment to illuminate the wax tablet that lay before him. Its surface carefully prepared with a mixture of beeswax, sheep's tallow, and powdered charcoal that created the proper consistency for receiving the impressions of his iron stylus. The year was 1237, and the techniques for recording and preserving knowledge had evolved through centuries of monastic scholarship, creating systems of notation and memory that served students and scholars throughout the universities and cathedral schools that were beginning to flourish across Christendom. The wax tablet itself measured approximately 8 inches in length and 6 inches in width, constructed from a wooden frame that held a thin layer of prepared wax within raised edges that protected the writing surface from accidental damage. The wood was typically oak or beech, selected for its resistance to warping and splitting, and carefully shaped using hand tools to create the precise dimensions and smooth surfaces required for effective use. The frame was joined using traditional woodworking techniques, with mortise and tenon joints, secured by wooden pegs that allowed the tablet to withstand the repeated handling and pressure that accompanied daily use in scholarly activities. The preparation of the wax surface required considerable skill and attention to detail, as the mixture had to achieve the proper consistency to accept clear impressions from the stylus, while remaining soft enough to be smoothed and reused repeatedly. The beeswax was obtained from the monastery's own hives, where brother beekeepers maintained colonies that provided not only wax for writing tablets, but also honey for the community's table and candles for liturgical use. The quality of the wax varied depending on the season and the types of flowers visited by the bees, with spring wax generally considered superior for writing purposes due to its finer texture and more consistent working properties. The sheep's tallow was rendered from the fat of animals slaughtered for the monastery's use, heated slowly in iron pots until the impurities separated and could be removed, leaving pure tallow that would blend smoothly with the beeswax. The proportions of wax to tallow were carefully controlled, with experienced scribes able to judge the proper mixture by examining the color and consistency of the heated materials. Too much tallow would make the writing surface too soft and prone to accidental marking, while insufficient tallow would create a surface that was too hard to accept clear impressions from the stylus. The addition of powdered charcoal served to darken the wax surface and provide better contrast for the marks made by the stylus, making written text easier to read under the limited lighting conditions that prevailed in medieval study environments. The charcoal was prepared by burning selected woods in controlled conditions that produced pure carbon without the impurities that would create poor color or texture in the finished writing surface. Willow and vine charcoals were particularly prized for this purpose, as they burned cleanly and could be ground to the fine powder required for blending with the wax mixture. The mixing process itself was performed while the wax and tallow were in liquid form, heated gently over small fires or braziers that provided controlled heat without the risk of overheating that might damage the materials or create an unworkable mixture. The charcoal powder was added gradually, while the mixture was stirred continuously with wooden paddles, ensuring even distribution throughout the mass. The timing of this process was critical, as the mixture had to be poured into the wooden frames, while it remained liquid enough to flow smoothly and settle evenly, but not so hot that it would damage the wood or create air bubbles in the finished surface. Once poured into the frames, the wax mixture was allowed to cool gradually, a process that might take several hours depending on the ambient temperature and the thickness of the wax layer. The cooling process had to be controlled to prevent rapid temperature changes that might cause the wax to crack or separate from the wooden frame. During cooling, the surface was occasionally smoothed with flat wooden tools to eliminate any irregularities that might interfere with writing, and the edges were carefully trimmed to ensure that the wax surface was flush with the protective rim of the wooden frame. The stylus used for writing on wax tablets was typically made from iron, bronze or bone, depending on the resources available and the preferences of individual users. Iron styluses were favored by many scribes because of their durability
and the clean, sharp lines they produced in the wax surface, but they required regular maintenance to prevent rust that might stain the wax or interfere with smooth writing. Bronze styluses were less prone to corrosion, but were more expensive and required greater skill to manufacture, while bone styluses were easily made and replaced, but wore down more quickly with regular use. The shape of the stylus was carefully designed to serve multiple functions in the writing process. One end was sharpened to a fine point for making clear impressions in the wax, while the other end was flattened and broadened to serve as an erasing tool that could smooth away mistakes or prepare areas of the tablet for reuse. The length of the stylus was typically between 4 and 6 inches, providing good control for detailed writing, while being long enough to prevent hand fatigue during extended writing sessions. The thickness was proportioned to provide comfortable grip, while maintaining the structural strength needed for repeated use. The technique of writing on wax tablets required different skills and approaches than writing with ink on parchment, as the stylus had to be pressed into the wax surface with sufficient force to create clear, lasting impressions without applying so much pressure that the wax was displaced or the wooden frame was damaged. The angle of the stylus relative to the writing surface was critical, with experienced scribes developing consistent hand positions that produced uniform letter forms and line spacing. The speed of writing was necessarily slower than with ink, as each letter had to be carefully formed through the controlled application of pressure to the wax surface. Letter forms used on wax tablets were often simplified compared to the elaborate scripts used in formal manuscripts, as the physical limitations of the medium favored clear, straightforward shapes that could be easily read and quickly executed. The Gothic scripts that were beginning to develop during this period were particularly well suited to wax tablet writing, as their angular forms translated effectively into the impressed lines created by stylus writing. However, scribes still maintained careful attention to letter spacing, line alignment, and overall page layout, to ensure that their notes remained legible and organized. The process of taking notes during lectures or while reading required careful planning and organization, as the limited surface area of wax tablets meant that space had to be used efficiently. Students developed systems of abbreviation and shorthand that allowed them to capture essential information without wasting precious writing surface. Common words and phrases were abbreviated using standardized systems that were taught as part of basic literacy education, while individual students often developed personal abbreviation systems for frequently encountered terms in their particular fields of study. The abbreviation systems used in medieval note-taking were based on principles that had been developed over centuries of manuscript production, where scribes had learned to conserve expensive parchment by shortening frequently used words. Sacred names were routinely abbreviated using the first and last letters with a line above to indicate the abbreviation, while common Latin words were shortened using conventional systems that were widely understood among educated individuals. Students learned these abbreviation systems as part of their basic training in literacy, and mastery of abbreviation techniques was considered essential for effective scholarly work. Memory techniques played a crucial role in medieval student life, as the limited capacity of wax tablets meant that information had to be transferred from temporary notes to more permanent mental storage. Students were trained in elaborate mnemonic systems that used visual imagery, spatial relationships, and rhythmic patterns to encode information in memory. These memory techniques were based on classical models developed by ancient Greek and Roman orators, adapted for medieval educational purposes, through the work of scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus. The memory palace technique was particularly important for medieval students, involving the mental construction of elaborate architectural spaces, where different pieces of information were associated with specific locations within imaginary buildings. Students would mentally walk through these constructed spaces during examinations or debates, retrieving information by visiting the locations where it had been stored. The effectiveness of these techniques was enhanced by repeated practice and the use of vivid, emotionally engaging imagery that made information more memorable. The daily routine of note-taking began with the preparation of the wax tablet surface, which involved smoothing away the previous day's writing using the flat end of the stylus and checking that the wax surface was clean and uniform. This preparation process was typically performed in the early morning before the day's first lecture or study session, allowing time for the wax to settle after being disturbed and ensuring that the writing surface was in optimal condition for receiving new impressions. Lectures in medieval universities and cathedral schools followed highly structured formats that facilitated systematic note-taking, with masters presenting material in organized sequences that allowed students to anticipate and prepare for key concepts and definitions. The lecture format itself had evolved specifically to accommodate the limitations of contemporary note-taking technology, with frequent repetition of important points and clear verbal signals that indicated when students should pay particular attention to specific information. The master would typically begin each lecture with a review of previously covered material, allowing students to refresh their memories and prepare their tablets for new information. Key concepts were presented multiple times using different phraseology and examples, giving students several opportunities to capture essential information, even if they missed details during the initial presentation. The pace of lectures was deliberately measured to allow time for note-taking, with natural pauses that gave students opportunities to complete their written records of important points. Students developed personal systems for organizing information on their wax tablets, often using visual layouts that reflected the hierarchical structure of medieval knowledge. Major topics might be indicated by larger or more elaborate letter forms, while supporting details were written in smaller script or indented to show their subordinate relationship to main themes. Lines and simple geometric shapes were sometimes used to create visual divisions between different topics, or to highlight particularly important information. The physical arrangement of students in lecture halls was designed to facilitate effective note-taking, with benches arranged so that each student had adequate space for their tablet and stylus, while being positioned to hear clearly and see any visual demonstrations that the master might provide. The acoustic properties of medieval lecture halls were carefully considered during construction, with vaulted ceilings and stone walls that enhanced the projection of the master's voice, while minimizing distracting echoes or sound interference. Lighting conditions in study environments presented constant challenges for medieval students, as most scholarly activities took place during daylight hours, when natural illumination was available through windows or openings in walls. The positioning of windows in scriptoriums and lecture halls was carefully planned to provide optimal lighting for reading and writing activities, with consideration given to the changing angle of sunlight throughout the day and across different seasons. When natural lighting was insufficient, students relied on various forms of artificial illumination including candles, oil lamps, and occasionally mirrors or polished metal surfaces that could redirect available light to improve working conditions. However, these artificial light sources were expensive and potentially dangerous in environments filled with flammable materials, so their use was carefully controlled and often limited to the most essential scholarly activities. The maintenance of wax tablets required regular attention to preserve their usefulness as writing instruments. The wax surface gradually accumulated debris and small particles that could interfere with clear writing, requiring periodic cleaning using soft cloths or brushes that removed contaminants without damaging the wax. The wooden frames also required maintenance, with periodic applications of oil or wax to prevent cracking and splitting that might compromise the integrity of the tablet. Seasonal variations in temperature and humidity affected the working properties of wax tablets, with cold conditions making the wax harder and more difficult to write on, while warm conditions could make the surface too soft to retain clear impressions. Students learned to adapt their writing techniques to accommodate these environmental variations, and some maintained multiple tablets with different wax formulations that performed better under specific conditions. The sharing and copying of notes among students required careful coordination, as the temporary nature of wax tablet writing meant that information could be easily lost if not promptly transferred to more permanent storage. Students often worked in groups to ensure that important information was captured by multiple individuals, reducing the risk that essential material would be lost due to individual errors or omissions. These collaborative note-taking arrangements also provided opportunities for discussion and clarification of difficult concepts. The transition from wax tablet notes to more permanent records involved several different approaches depending on the importance of the information and the resources available to individual students. Essential information might be memorized using mnemonic techniques and later reconstructed from memory, while particularly important material might be copied onto precious parchment or vellum for permanent preservation. Some students maintained both temporary wax tablet notes and more selective permanent records, using the tablets for daily note-taking and transferring only the most valuable information to permanent storage. The cost considerations involved in medieval note-taking were significant factors in determining how students managed their scholarly materials. Wax tablets, while requiring initial investment in materials and construction, could be reused repeatedly, and represented a relatively economical solution for temporary note-taking needs. However, the creation of permanent records required expensive materials including parchment, vellum, and inks that were beyond the financial resources of many students. The economic constraints that affected student life led to the development of various resource-sharing arrangements, including the collaborative creation of permanent manuscript copies that could be shared among groups of students. These collaborative manuscripts often reflected the collective efforts of entire study groups, with different students contributing different sections or different types of expertise to create comprehensive records that no individual could have afforded to produce independently. Book production in medieval scriptoriums provided alternative models for creating permanent records of scholarly material, with professional scribes and illuminators creating manuscript copies that could serve multiple students over extended periods. However, the high cost and limited availability of these professional manuscripts meant that most students had to rely primarily on temporary note-taking methods supplemented by occasional access to shared permanent resources. The development of university libraries began to provide institutional solutions to some of the resource constraints that affected individual students, with collections of manuscripts that could be consulted for reference purposes, even though they could not be borrowed or copied freely. Library use required special permissions and often involved additional fees, but it provided access to authoritative texts that would otherwise have been completely unavailable to students of limited means. The preservation of knowledge across generations depended heavily on the memory skills of individual scholars who served as living repositories of information that might not exist in permanent written form. Master teachers were expected to maintain comprehensive mental libraries of their subject matter, and the relationship between masters and students involved not only the transmission of specific information, but also the teaching of memory techniques and organizational systems that would allow students to preserve and utilize knowledge throughout their careers. The oral tradition remained a crucial component of medieval education even as written materials became more available, with formal debates, recitations, and structured discussions serving to reinforce and test the retention of material that had been initially encountered through lectures and note-taking. These oral exercises provided regular opportunities for students to practice retrieving information from memory, and to identify areas where additional study or review might be needed. The gradual transition toward greater reliance on written materials that occurred during the later medieval period represented a fundamental shift in educational methodology, with implications that extended far beyond simple changes in note-taking technology. The increased availability of written texts began to change the relationship between memory and learning, allowing students to rely more heavily on external storage of information, while potentially reducing the emphasis on the elaborate memory techniques that had been central to earlier educational approaches. As evening approached and the natural light began to fade from the scriptorium windows, Brother Geoffrey carefully smoothed the surface of his wax tablet with the broad end of his stylus, preparing the writing surface for the following day's lessons, while reviewing in his mind the essential points that he had captured during the day's lectures. Using the memory techniques that had been passed down through generations of scholars who had learned to preserve and transmit knowledge using the tools and methods available, in an age when the written word was precious, and the human memory served as the primary repository for the accumulated wisdom of centuries.
The lamplighter's day began in the peculiar quietude that settled over the city in those hours before dawn, when the last of the oil flames flickered low in their glass housings, and the first pale suggestions of daylight had not yet begun to soften the edges of the darkness. Thomas Whitmore had been walking these same cobblestone routes for nearly 18 years, his leather satchel heavy with the tools of his trade, the soft jingle of metal implements creating a gentle rhythm that matched his measured pace through the empty streets. The city employed 47 lamplighters in total, each assigned to specific districts that had been carefully mapped and recorded in the municipal ledgers, with routes designed to ensure that no lamp would remain unattended for more than the prescribed interval. His rounds began each morning at precisely 4:30, starting with Merchants' Row, where the gas lamps stood in neat intervals of 23 feet, a measurement that had been determined after considerable deliberation by the Public Works Committee in 1847. The committee had spent months reviewing proposals from various lamp manufacturers, examining detailed drawings that specified the optimal spacing for both illumination coverage and fuel efficiency. Thomas carried with him a brass key ring containing 14 different keys, each one carefully labeled with small paper tags that bore the street names written in his own careful script. The keys themselves were forged by the municipal blacksmith, according to specifications that varied slightly depending on the lamp manufacturer, as the city had purchased fixtures from 3 different companies over the course of the previous decade. The morning routine followed a pattern that had been refined through years of repetition and small adjustments. Thomas would approach each lamp post, withdraw the appropriate key from his ring, and unlock the small access panel that housed the gas valve mechanism. Inside, the brass fittings gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light, their surfaces worn smooth from daily handling. The gas valves required a precise quarter turn to close completely, and Thomas had developed a practiced touch that allowed him to shut off the flow without over-tightening, which could damage the delicate internal mechanisms that regulated the gas pressure. After extinguishing each flame, he would spend several minutes cleaning the glass chimney with a soft cloth that he kept specifically for this purpose, removing the accumulated soot and condensation that had gathered during the night's burning. The glass required careful handling, as replacements were costly and had to be ordered specifically from the lamp manufacturer, often resulting in delays of several weeks, while the new components were manufactured and shipped. Thomas kept detailed records of which lamps required glass replacement, noting the information in a small leather-bound notebook that he carried in his vest pocket, along with observations about gas flow irregularities or mechanical issues that might require attention from the city's lamp maintenance crew. The city's gas supply system had been installed in stages over a period of 8 years, beginning with the main commercial thoroughfares and gradually expanding to include residential streets as funding became available and the municipal gas works expanded their capacity. The gas itself was manufactured at a plant located on the outskirts of the city, where coal was heated in large retorts to produce the combustible gas that was then piped through an increasingly complex network of underground mains. Thomas had learned to recognize the subtle variations in gas pressure that occurred throughout the system, noting how lamps at the end of long pipe runs sometimes burned with slightly smaller flames, particularly during periods of high demand when many lamps were operating simultaneously. Each lamp post stood approximately 12 feet in height, constructed of cast iron that had been painted with multiple coats of black paint to protect against rust and weathering. The posts were anchored into the cobblestone street surface with iron brackets that extended down into carefully excavated foundations filled with packed stone and mortar. The installation process for each lamp had required coordination between the gasworks, the street department, and the lamp maintenance crew, with detailed drawings prepared to show the exact placement and connection specifications for the underground gas lines. Thomas carried a small tin of lamp oil for emergency situations, though the gas lamps rarely required such backup illumination. The oil was a carefully refined product that burned with minimal smoke and odor, purchased in large quantities by the city and distributed to lamplighters in measured portions according to established protocols. He also carried a selection of small tools including a brass wire brush for cleaning burner tips, a small adjustable wrench for tightening loose fittings, and several spare gaskets made of rubber that could be used to repair minor leaks in the gas connections. The morning extinguishing process moved methodically from street to street, following a route that had been designed to minimize backtracking while ensuring that all lamps in the district received attention within the designated time window. Thomas knew the peculiarities of each individual lamp, recognizing which ones tended to accumulate more soot due to their proximity to chimney smoke from nearby buildings,
and which ones required slightly different handling due to minor variations in their internal mechanisms. Some of the older lamps, installed during the initial phases of the gas lighting system, had slightly different valve configurations that required specific techniques for proper operation. The paperwork associated with lamp lighting duties included daily reports that documented any maintenance issues, fuel consumption irregularities, or damage to lamp fixtures that might have occurred during the night. Thomas submitted these reports to the municipal lamp supervisor each Friday, along with his weekly schedule of planned maintenance activities and requests for replacement parts or materials. The supervisor maintained comprehensive records of lamp performance across all districts, tracking patterns of mechanical failure and fuel usage that informed decisions about replacement schedules and preventive maintenance protocols. As the morning progressed and natural daylight began to illuminate the streets more fully, Thomas would complete his extinguishing rounds and return to the municipal lamp depot where he would prepare his equipment for the evening lighting routine. The depot housed supplies of replacement glass chimneys, spare keys, cleaning materials, and the various small components that might be needed for routine maintenance tasks. Other lamplighters would arrive throughout the morning, each carrying similar reports and observations from their respective districts, creating a steady flow of information about the overall condition of the city's lighting infrastructure. The depot itself occupied a narrow building that had previously served as a carriage house, its interior adapted with wooden shelving systems that held the various supplies required for lamp maintenance operations. The shelves were labeled with careful script that indicated the contents of each section, from replacement wicks and glass components to specialized tools and cleaning materials. A large wooden table dominated the center of the space, its surface marked with ink stains and small scratches that accumulated from years of use for equipment maintenance and record-keeping activities. Thomas would spend the middle portion of his day performing routine maintenance tasks on lamps that had been identified during his morning rounds as requiring attention beyond the standard daily cleaning procedures. This work involved more detailed disassembly of lamp mechanisms, careful cleaning of internal components, and replacement of worn parts according to established protocols. The maintenance procedures had been developed through years of experience and observation, with written guidelines that specified the steps required for various types of repairs and adjustments. The brass components of the lamp mechanisms required periodic polishing to maintain their efficiency and prevent corrosion that could affect gas flow and ignition reliability. Thomas used a specially formulated polishing compound that was applied with soft cloth according to techniques that had been refined through trial and observation. The polishing process involved careful attention to the small crevices and joints where corrosion typically began, with particular focus on the valve seats and gasket surfaces that were critical for maintaining proper gas pressure and preventing leaks. Gas pressure monitoring represented one of the most critical aspects of the lamp lighting system, requiring constant attention to subtle variations that could indicate problems with supply lines or individual lamp mechanisms. Thomas had learned to recognize the characteristic sounds and flame patterns that indicated various types of pressure irregularities, from the soft whistling that suggested minor leaks in gasket seals to the irregular flickering that indicated problems with burner adjustment or gas flow restrictions. The city's gas works operated according to a complex schedule that coordinated production and distribution to meet the varying demands of residential, commercial, and municipal customers. The lamp lighting system represented a significant portion of the total gas consumption, particularly during winter months when longer nights required extended operation of the street lighting network. Thomas received periodic updates about planned maintenance activities at the gasworks that might affect pressure or availability, allowing him to adjust his procedures and prepare for any disruptions to normal service. The evening routine began approximately 1 hour before sunset, with timing that varied seasonally according to detailed tables that had been prepared by the city engineer's office. Thomas would begin his evening rounds by checking his equipment and reviewing any special instructions or maintenance notes that had accumulated during the day. The lighting process required even more careful attention than the morning extinguishing, as proper ignition of each lamp required specific techniques to ensure clean burning and optimal flame adjustment. Each lamp required individual attention during the lighting process, beginning with a visual inspection of the glass chimney and burner assembly to ensure that no debris or moisture had accumulated since the morning cleaning. Thomas carried a special lighting taper, essentially a long brass rod with a small ignition mechanism at one end, that allowed him to safely light each burner while maintaining proper distance from the gas flame. The technique required timing the ignition to coincide with the opening of the gas valve, creating a smooth sequence that produced immediate clean burning without the brief flare-ups that could damage the glass chimney or create excessive smoke. The lighting taper itself represented a specialized tool that had been developed specifically for gas lamp ignition, with a design that incorporated lessons learned from years of practical experience. The brass construction provided durability and heat resistance, while the length allowed the lamplighter to maintain safe distance from the gas flame during the ignition process. The ignition mechanism at the tip contained a small amount of specially prepared material that would ignite reliably when struck against a rough surface, producing a controlled flame that could be applied to the gas burner with precision. Thomas maintained his lighting taper according to established procedures that included regular cleaning of the brass surfaces and periodic replacement of the ignition material at the tip. The replacement process involved careful removal of spent ignition material and application of fresh compound according to proportions that had been determined through experimentation and testing. The municipal lamp department maintained supplies of ignition material and provided detailed instructions for its proper application and use. The gas pressure throughout the system required constant monitoring and adjustment, as variations in demand and supply could affect the quality of illumination across the entire network. Thomas had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated pressure irregularities, such as flames that burned with unusual colors or flickering patterns that suggested problems with the gas supply or internal lamp mechanisms. These observations became part of his regular reports, contributing to the ongoing efforts to maintain consistent performance across the lighting system. Street cleaning crews worked around the lamplighting schedule, timing their activities to avoid interference with the lamplighter's duties while ensuring that debris and accumulated matter did not affect the operation of the lamp fixtures. The coordination between different municipal departments required careful scheduling and communication, with written protocols that specified the timing and methods for various maintenance activities that might affect the lighting system. The lamplighter's tools required their own maintenance routine, with regular cleaning and occasional replacement of worn components. The brass lighting taper needed periodic polishing to maintain its efficiency, while the various keys required occasional adjustment to ensure proper fit with their corresponding lamp mechanisms. Thomas maintained his equipment according to standards that had been developed through years of practical experience, keeping detailed records of tool performance and replacement schedules that helped inform procurement decisions for the entire lamplighting department. Winter months brought additional challenges to the lamplighting routine, as shorter daylight hours extended the period during which lamps needed to operate, while cold temperatures could affect gas flow and mechanical performance. Thomas carried additional materials during winter months, including small amounts of lubricating oil that could be applied to valve mechanisms that became stiff in cold weather, and extra cleaning cloths to address the increased condensation that accumulated on glass surfaces during periods of high humidity and temperature variation. The lubricating oil required careful application according to specific procedures that had been developed to prevent contamination of gas lines or interference with combustion processes. Thomas applied the oil using small brushes that were cleaned thoroughly after each use and stored in sealed containers to prevent contamination. The oil itself was a specially refined product that maintained its lubricating properties across a wide range of temperatures while remaining chemically stable when exposed to gas vapors. Cold weather also affected the glass chimneys, which became more susceptible to cracking when exposed to rapid temperature changes. Thomas learned to recognize the conditions that were most likely to cause thermal stress in the glass components, adjusting his lighting procedures to minimize sudden temperature variations that could damage the delicate glass structures. The prevention of glass breakage represented a significant cost savings for the municipal lighting department, as replacement chimneys were expensive and often required extended waiting periods for delivery. The seasonal variations in daylight hours required constant adjustment of lighting schedules, with detailed calculations performed each month to determine the precise timing for lamp ignition and extinguishing operations. Thomas received updated schedule sheets from the municipal engineer's office that specified the exact times for lighting operations based on astronomical calculations and local weather patterns. These schedules took into account gradual changes in sunset and sunrise times, as well as seasonal variations in atmospheric conditions that could affect visibility and lighting requirements. The city's expansion gradually increased the number of lamps in Thomas's district, requiring adjustments to his daily routine and occasional reorganization of his established routes. New installations followed standardized procedures that had been refined over years of experience, with detailed specifications for lamp placement, gas line connections, and foundation requirements that ensured consistency with existing infrastructure while accommodating the specific characteristics of different street layouts and building configurations. Each new lamp installation required coordination with multiple city departments, beginning with surveying to determine exact placement and continuing through excavation for gas line connections and foundation preparation. Thomas participated in the planning process for new installations, providing practical insights about maintenance requirements and operational considerations that influence the final design specifications. His experience with daily maintenance operations made him particularly valuable for identifying potential problems with proposed installations before they became costly issues. The municipal record-keeping system included detailed documentation of lamp performance, maintenance activities, and supply consumption that provided comprehensive information about lighting system operations over extended periods. Thomas's daily observations contributed to these records, creating an ongoing chronicle of infrastructure performance that informed planning decisions and budget allocations for system improvements and expansions. The accumulated data revealed patterns of wear and failure that helped predict maintenance requirements and optimize replacement schedules for various components of the lighting infrastructure. The record keeping involved multiple forms and documentation procedures that had been developed to capture different aspects of lamp system performance. Thomas completed daily inspection sheets that recorded the condition of individual lamps, noting any irregularities in flame quality, glass condition, or mechanical operation that might require attention. Weekly summary reports compiled this information into broader patterns that could be analyzed for trends and systematic issues affecting multiple lamps or entire districts. Supply inventory management represented another aspect of the lamplighter's responsibilities, with careful tracking of consumable materials and replacement parts required to maintain adequate supplies for ongoing operations. Thomas maintained detailed records of his usage of cleaning materials, replacement components, and specialized supplies, submitting regular requests for replenishment based on established consumption patterns and projected requirements for upcoming maintenance activities. The procurement process for lamp supplies involved coordination with multiple vendors and manufacturers, each specializing in different components of the lighting system. Glass chimneys were ordered from a glassworks located in a neighboring city, while brass components came from a specialized metalworking shop that had developed expertise in gas lamp mechanisms. The ordering process required precise specifications and quality standards to ensure compatibility with existing equipment and reliability under normal operating conditions. Thomas's leather satchel showed the wear of daily use, its surface polished smooth by years of handling and marked with the small stains and scratches that accumulated from regular contact with lamp cleaning materials and metal tools. He had replaced the satchel twice during his 18 years of service, each time choosing similar leather goods that provided the necessary durability and organization for the tools and materials required for his daily duties. The satchel's internal compartments had been arranged according to his personal preferences, with specific pockets designated for different categories of tools and supplies that allowed for efficient access during his rounds. The leather itself required periodic maintenance to preserve its flexibility and water resistance, with regular applications of specially prepared oil that prevented cracking and maintained the durability of the stitching and hardware. Thomas performed this maintenance according to a seasonal schedule, timing the treatments to coincide with periods of reduced activity during the lamp lighting routine when his equipment could be temporarily out of service for maintenance procedures. The rhythmic nature of the lamp lighting routine created a meditative quality to the work, with the repetitive motions of key handling, valve operation, and glass cleaning becoming second nature through years of practice. Thomas moved through his routes with the measured pace of someone who understood that haste could lead to mistakes, while excessive slowness could result in incomplete coverage of his assigned district before the designated completion times. The balance between efficiency and thoroughness required constant attention to timing and technique, with small adjustments made continually to accommodate changing conditions and varying requirements. The physical demands of the lamp lighting work required careful attention to body mechanics and ergonomic considerations, as the repetitive motions and sustained walking involved in daily rounds could cause strain and fatigue over extended periods. Thomas had developed techniques for managing these physical requirements, including specific methods for lifting and carrying equipment that minimized stress on his back and shoulders, and pacing strategies that distributed the workload evenly throughout his daily routine. Weather conditions significantly affected the lamp lighting routine, with rain, snow, and wind creating additional challenges for maintaining reliable illumination and protecting delicate equipment from damage. Thomas carried waterproof coverings for his tools and supplies during inclement weather, and had developed techniques for operating lamp mechanisms, while wearing gloves and working in conditions of reduced visibility. Rain presented particular challenges for glass cleaning operations, as moisture could interfere with the effectiveness of cleaning materials and create streaking that reduced illumination quality. Thomas had learned to adjust his cleaning techniques based on humidity and precipitation conditions, using different materials and methods to achieve consistent results regardless of weather conditions. The municipal lamp department provided specialized cleaning compounds that were formulated to work effectively in various atmospheric conditions. Snow and ice created hazardous conditions for walking the lamplighter routes, requiring additional time and care to navigate safely while carrying equipment and performing maintenance tasks. Thomas carried small amounts of sand or ash during winter months that could be applied to icy surfaces around lamp posts to provide better footing during maintenance operations. The city's street maintenance crews coordinated their snow removal activities with the lamp lighting schedule to ensure that lamp access was maintained during severe weather conditions. Wind could affect both the operation of gas flames and the safety of ladder work required for reaching lamp mechanisms mounted on tall posts. Thomas had learned to recognize wind conditions that might interfere with reliable lamp operation, adjusting ignition timing and flame settings to compensate for air currents that could cause flickering or extinguishing of gas flames. Strong winds also required postponement of certain maintenance activities that involved working at height or handling delicate glass components. The gradual transition from oil to gas lighting had required extensive planning and coordination among multiple city departments, with pilot installations and testing programs that validated the performance and reliability of gas-based illumination systems before their widespread adoption. Thomas had participated in some of these early trials, providing feedback about operational procedures and maintenance requirements that influenced the final design specifications for the expanded gas lighting network. The transition process involved careful evaluation of different lamp designs and manufacturers, with testing programs that compared performance characteristics including flame stability, fuel efficiency, maintenance requirements, and overall reliability under various operating conditions. Thomas contributed detailed observations about the practical aspects of daily maintenance operations, helping to identify design features that facilitated routine service and prevented common operational problems. Economic considerations played a significant role in the transition planning, with detailed cost analyses comparing the ongoing expenses of oil-based lighting systems with the capital investment and operating costs associated with gas infrastructure. The municipal finance department prepared comprehensive studies that projected long-term savings from improved efficiency and reduced labor requirements, taking into account the initial costs of installing gas distribution networks and converting existing lamp fixtures. Public safety considerations required careful attention to the reliability and consistency of illumination provided by the new gas lighting system, with particular focus on maintaining adequate lighting levels during adverse weather conditions and system maintenance periods. Thomas provided input about backup procedures and contingency plans that could ensure continued lighting service during planned maintenance activities or unexpected equipment failures. As evening settled over the city and the newly lit lamps began their nightly vigil, Thomas would complete his lighting rounds and make his final notes about any issues or observations that required attention. The soft glow of gas flames created pools of warm light along the darkening streets, each lamp contributing its measured portion of illumination to the overall pattern of urban lighting that had become an essential element of city life. The quiet satisfaction of completing another day's work in the service of public safety and convenience provided its own reward, as Thomas made his way home through streets that bore the gentle evidence of his daily labor. The steady flames burning with the reliable consistency that represented the culmination of countless small acts of careful attention and methodical maintenance, each lamp standing as a testament to the quiet dedication required to maintain the infrastructure that allowed city life to continue safely and comfortably through the hours of darkness.